But moving on with our agenda, our next presenter will be virtual, and I'll let him do his own full introduction. I hope he's here. Eric Searle, presenting on large landscape modeling.
So I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude and acknowledging that I'm joining our meeting today from Sault Ste. Marie, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Area, and on Métis homeland and harvesting territory. I pay my respect to Batchewana First Nation and Garden River First Nation. And I am sorry that it's me presenting. It should be the PhD student of this project, Connor Jones. Unfortunately, he had to be in Toronto today and couldn't make it up to Chapleau. So as Isabel mentioned, my name is Eric Searle. I'm a research scientist with the Ontario Forest Research Institute with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And I'll be talking today about the Integrated Forest Modeling Platform, which is a large research collaboration between the Canadian Institute of Forestry, Wakatoan, Lakehead University, and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Really quickly, CIF, the Canadian Institute of Forestry, has an agreement with the ministry to develop a new integrated forest modeling platform to determine the impact of intensive or improved forest management and determine candidate sites throughout the province. Wakatoan has a separate agreement to support the First Nations engagement on model development. And thank you very much, Isabel and David, for making some time for me to talk today. I wanted to first sort of touch on, what a forest model is, because I think it's good to set up people's expectations before we go in too far. And it's really important to highlight that a forest model is a representation of reality. It's not a definite outcome. I often refer to these forecasts as hypotheses or suggestions. Obviously, there are many things that can happen in sort of the decades that we're simulating. We can't guarantee that the numbers that we're spitting out will be 100% correct. However, these forest models are needed in forest management. We're predicting changes over large areas. Most of our forest management units are 1 million hectares or more. We're talking long time frames, typically on the order of a century or two, for planning purposes. And that's very difficult to do with just a pen and some graphing paper. And really the maxim, I guess, that I want you to take away from this is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the intent of this project is to build a useful model, acknowledging that it's going to be wrong. So some challenges facing our current forest management models. In recent decades, forest management emphasis has shifted away from sustained fiber yield and thankfully shifted to include more ecological considerations and overall sustainable forest management. However, our modeling approaches have lagged behind a lot of these shifts, and this really challenged forest modeling. And right now it's difficult to examine effects of zoning across the province, so adding more parks and protected areas, which I'll speak to a little bit more in a moment. Effects of new silviculture and management methods, looking at intentional mixed species forests, as well as novel silviculture. Areas at risk from climate change can be difficult to identify, as well as good candidate areas for intensive or improved forest management, as well as determining how sort of processes and mechanisms act over space. So for example, forest disturbances. Although one caveat here, I'm very excited that we are moving to spatial planning, hopefully for the next round of forest management plans, which is a big step forward. So I kind of want to get a little bit deeper, I guess, into what the issue is facing current forest management models. And current forest management models are largely empirical, which means they're based on real world observations, which is great. They're very robust to the conditions that we've already seen, but it means that we use professional opinion to create yield curves, or in this case, estimates of what a stand might become in the future, to address situations like novel silviculture or sort of more pressingly, climate change. An example of this might be mixed species stands. They're often modeled or predicted as basically a weighted average of species compositions. So if you have a half jack pine, half black spruce stand, when you get to your yield table, you would predict that as a half pine yield and a half spruce yield, even though we know that species interact with one another, and often the sum of the whole is greater than its parts. This is an area of active research. My colleague Mahadev Sharma is adding tons of species mixtures that will be available for next planting cycle, but sort of needing or keeping in mind, I should say, that the focus is often on commercial species. And as a temperate research scientist, I also say very focused on the boreal, although I recognize that most of Treaty 9 is boreal for sure. One way we kind of get around this, though, is to use mechanistic models. So models that use first principles, and here when I say first principles, I mean inherent sort of biological and physical properties to calculate stand growth from site quality, light availability, and climate. And that allows us to model new conditions we may not have seen before. The way it does that is it takes information on things like temperature and precipitation and says, okay, we know how temperature and precipitation affects tree growth, so we'll calculate growth based on new temperature and precipitation. But that also has downstream effects on light availability. As trees grow, stands close in, crowns close in, and there's less light available. So the model does take that kind of development into account. And finally, we also have site-specific effects, usually to do with soil, although slope and aspect certainly affect this, that constrain the amount of growth that's possible. And we need to take that into account as well. And from these sort of basic mechanisms, we can put forward a model that simulates stand growth into the future without needing to have observed the condition in the past. So, David often gives me, a hard time for being an egghead, and I recognize that I like numbers, but not everyone does. So I did also want to bring some actual forestry to this forest modeling talk and show some pictures of what I'm talking about. I wanted to focus on two sites. The first, both of them are part of the NIBI experimental network. And the NIBI experimental network, the basic idea is to look at forest management and stratify it from just walking into a block and harvesting it, doing no post-harvest silviculture and seeing what happens, versus going all the way up to an elite treatment where you're almost throwing everything at the wall and seeing if you can really get the species comps and the productivity that you desire. So one example is the Timmins site. This is about 20 or 30 kilometers south of Timmins. It's a boreal mixed wood, aspen and spruce primarily. And the kind of novel idea here was to examine what an intimate mixture of aspen and spruce could look like on the landscape. And so this is not just allowing some aspen to stay in your spruce dominant stand. This is intentionally keeping aspen and spruce close together. And I've got an example, a visual example of what that looks like. We know that mixtures of aspen and spruce outperform the average yield from aspen or spruce on their own. So again, the whole outweighs the sum of the parts in this case. And yeah, one way to take advantage of this is to leave some aspen canopy mixed throughout the stand. We come back after 40 or 50 years, harvest that aspen canopy, and then harvest the spruce canopy after 70 to 100 years. So what this looks like, again, this is a boreal mixed wood. It was about 50% spruce, 50% aspen at the time of harvest. And after 20 years, this is what harvest only looks like. It is essentially an aspen monoculture. There is the odd birch that has managed to survive, but generally speaking, it is just an aspen monoculture. On the other end of the scale, this intimate mixture where we still have an aspen canopy. We're still getting those wonderful ecosystem services that a nice high canopy provides. But we're utilizing some of that underutilized space in the understory to allow for spruce to grow up. And this means that in 40 to 50 years, 20 years from the time of this picture being taken, when that canopy comes off, there will be some nice spruce that are ready to take advantage of that space and form, late successional conifer habitat into the future, while also being, highly valuable. The second site I wanted to talk about briefly was Sioux Lookout NIBI. So this was a jack pine dominated site with pockets of spruce throughout. And the silviculture idea here is to overstock the jack pine and then thin it back. And the idea behind this is it mimics natural disturbances. So typically post-fire, jack pine, will be basically a carpet of seedlings everywhere. But it also helps train the trees. It allows for more clear wood production. You get finer branches. And high density early on can also promote early productivity. So you get a nice carbon storage bump early on. and minimize other woody competition from coming in. But what we do need to do is enter this stand after about 20 years or so and reduce that jack pine density before that natural competition kicks in and really starts to limit the growth of these trees. So in this instance, we do have some models of jack pine yield by density, but there are really few growth and yield plots available for them. Dave Morris has done a lot of work on this, and how this sort of thinning regime interacts with climate change is kind of an open question, really. So again, a couple of pictures of actual forests for this forest modeling presentation. We have a pre-thin condition here, and then the same plot taken in almost the same orientation, although you can imagine that that's difficult to do, post-thin. And a couple of things about this thinning regime. Wayne Bell, who's the lead investigator, left all of the black spruce so that we're mimicking that natural diversity, as well as leaving green alder, which is a nitrogen fixing shrub and can potentially help basically fertilize these sites naturally by increasing the amount of nitrogen in the soil. So these are some of the examples of improved forest management that we kind of struggle with to model right now, but we're hoping to build a model that can actually credibly forecast these conditions into the future. And no talk of simulating forecasting forest types in the future, would be complete without acknowledging kind of the looming threat above all of this, which is climate change. And these are graphs for averages across the province. We know that temperature is going to increase across the province, and precipitation will, probably stay relatively constant, which means it's going to be hotter and trees are not going to have as much water to grow. And that will certainly put a stress on the forest. We need to highlight zones that might be at most at risk from climate change, but also areas that might actually see an increase in productivity because they were constrained by lower temperatures. So I'm very thankful actually that I'm going after Josie and Christine, who both gave great presentations, because I can kind of fly through this pretty quickly when we're talking about what we need for our input. We need a LiDAR enhanced FRI, so forest resources inventory. We need to know where the trees are and what those trees are and how many trees there are. We need LiDAR information, so elevation that was shown off in the Lamazoo. Also slope and aspects, we have a good idea sort of what these sites actually look like. We need a base climate layer to say, what is the climate these trees are experiencing right now? And we need silviculture maps. So Christine showed those wonderful pictures of all of the cut blocks. We need to take that information so we know what stage of development these stands are in. So we can take all of that, put it together, and come out with sort of a snapshot of our current forest land base. And actually, we use a lot of the same information that Christine was showing off in Lamazoo. So you can imagine taking that Lamazoo forest land base as our model input. So from there, we take that land base, we put it through a landscape disturbance model. This is going to calculate everything from wildfire to pest outbreaks like spruce budworm in the Northeast, for instance, as well as some disturbances like windthrow and harvest as well. That sort of gives us the forest land base after it's experienced disturbances for a year. And we can take that forest land base, apply our silviculture, and grow our trees forward 1 year, which then gives us a forecast of the forest land base 1 year into the future. From that forecast of 1 year in the future, we can take it, run it back through this sort of modeling infrastructure, and get our forest land base 2 years into the future. Run it back through 3 years into the future, run it back through 4 years into the future, right? And so on and so forth, until we sort of reach our endpoint. And what we really hope that we'll be able to derive from this forest land base is a future prediction of an FRI. And what that means is we can use our existing sort of modeling infrastructure on top of that FRI to derive ecosystem services and say, okay, great, we have all of these species, their compositions and their amounts. Now what services do they provide to us? And ideally, we can pass this off to Isabel or to Christine to incorporate into Lamazoo as well to do some of that really cool visualization work. Again, sort of the theme of this presentation, we have the looming threat of climate change. And one of the things that's really cool about this model, in my opinion, is we can take climate change and apply it at the scale it operates on. What I mean by that is climate change will affect landscape disturbances. We know it will affect the rate of wildfire. We know that climate change will affect individual tree growth, and we can account for that. And we know that climate change will affect ecosystem services as well. So with this infrastructure, we hope to be able to sort of model the effects of climate change at the scale that it operates on. Quick example of some model outcomes, kind of what it can look like. This comes from another modeling group who focuses on Quebec. This is the managed forest in Quebec here, Yann Boulanger at the Canadian Forest Service. I just wanted to flash this quickly to show, a pretty high resolution spatial map of relative abundance, in this case, black spruce. The brown section here means no real change. The green means more black spruce, and the red means less black spruce. As you can tell, there's pretty dire predictions in this case for black spruce in Quebec. So talked a little bit about how this model works, and I wanted to highlight sort of some of the scenarios that we're going to be looking at. When it comes to climate change, we're thinking about 3 scenarios right now. The first is a baseline climate, just to get a baseline average to always be able to compare back to. So this will likely be the climate from 1980 to 2010. We'll look at RCP 2.6, which is currently the most optimistic model, peak warming by mid-century, but then a decline. This requires major policy shifts to achieve and is looking increasingly unlikely every year, but I like to hold at least a little bit of optimism. And we'll look at RCP 4.5, which is sort of thought of as the most likely model. This one has warming peaking around 2100. And the basic assumption here is that there's little change to current policies, and we're using all existing fossil fuel reserves rather than keeping it in the ground. For management, we have right now 4 scenarios, but this is a section that we as the modeling team and Connor specifically is really looking for some feedback on. The first is business as usual, once again, assuming similar harvest levels to the current planting cycle, just to provide us a baseline. Looking at a full sustainable harvest, so here assuming the use of full available harvest area. 30% conservation. This is something we've heard a lot from David and Isabel in our conversations. So here we'll assume similar harvest levels to the current planting cycle, but include 30% of area as conservation by 2030. And finally, 30% conservation with zoning. So assuming, again, similar harvest levels, but we're going to ensure that 30% of area is conserved and also look for offsets in terms of intensive forest management zones. So all in all, this gives us 12 simulations, which is quite a bit for us to dig through. I just wanted to flash this quickly to give you an idea, of sort of, I guess, the constraints. Each of these models will likely take a day and a half to 2 days to run. So Connor's looking at an action-packed summer in the basement at Lakehead University, staring at a computer screen, but one that he's very excited for. So if you do have inputs, we're very happy to talk through this and ideally modify some of these management scenarios, but we're definitely open to adding 1 or 2 others as well. So outcomes, almost done here. I'm just noticing my time, but vegetation layers that demonstrate effects of different climate change and management scenarios on forest composition and abundance. And again, integrating those climate change effects at each scale. Then we also want to use those further models to estimate other parameters and examine co-benefits of each scenario, management and climate change scenario. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this, what we've heard from David and Isabel so far. Focus on the effects of 30% conservation by 2030. They've asked us to focus on wetlands, getting as much of that area sort of into that 30% target as possible. Effects of these scenarios on water quality, effects of these scenarios on moose habitat, effects of reduction in herbicide use. And again, if there are others that people would like to see, I'm happy to talk about that now, or pardon me, in question time, or get in contact with Connor. And one of the things that we're interested in hearing from outside of wetlands is if there are forest types that should be favored for conservation. The very last point I have is this is also about capacity building. Once vegetation layers are forecast, we hope to continue working with Wakatoan to support their analysis and research, things like feeding into Lamazoo so that it can be visualized and sort of, I guess, tangibly held. Is a really important part of this project, and Connor does have time at the end of his PhD to make sure this is really well documented and transferred in a responsible way. With all of that, I want to say thank you to our modeling partners, Guy Laroque at the Canadian Forest Service, Stephen Mayer with the Ministry, Matt Leach up at Lakehead University, project coordinators, Wayne Bell with the Ministry, Natasha Machado at the CIF, to Isabel Allen and David Flood for their time and thoughtful input. And I'd also like to continued support. And I'll leave that there with Connor's contact information.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Okay, so in the interest of time, so we do have the email up here. If anyone wants to send a question to Connor, you certainly can, but I'll take one question from the floor for Eric.
So David here. Thanks, Eric. So judging by the quietness on the floor, we're either really enjoying our moose stew or we're half asleep and it's warm in the room. But I just wanted to share, again, Wahkohtowin is asked by its 3 owner First Nations to try and find innovative ways to take a forward look at what does the future look like for forestry and its impacts on our traditional territories. As I said before, we have roughly 7 million hectares of 7 SFLs. So it's a chunk of real estate out there that it fits within this large landscape modeling concept. And of course, where is climate change going? Where is resiliency? Where is our future for cultural landscapes to persist into the future? If certain species are going to be falling off, you know, I'm sure the Wild Basket would like to know a little bit about the trends on potential impacts on your community's needs for food, land consumption of food sovereignty, food security. So I guess that's the interesting part, right? If climate change is real and we believe it, and the world demand for wood consumption is going up 4 times in this decade, and this province wants to double wood consumption while be silent on conservation planning, it's important that we try and push the yardsticks on some of these conversations to say and ready ourselves for what is that collective and common future. So we need nation-to-nation discussion with our Section 92 little brother partner. They got to come out and work with us. It has to be real. It has to be construct. We have to get on with consultation. So this is part of the innovation lab and the work we're trying to do with the extension work and everything that comes out of this into the future. We want to help roll it out and engage as many nations as possible. So that's why this symposium is important, because here's some of our efforts of what we're trying to do. Bring forward knowledge and research in different capacities, whether we're leading it or we're collaborating in it, and then push it out to the nations at large, and as well bring in your involvement. So I just want to put some context to what we were working on. Miigwech.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you. Summed up some of my points nicely to wrap up this session. So this was our emerging conservation technologies, and really we're looking at different tools that we're developing here to put in our toolbox and then share more broadly with everyone else. And like I've mentioned a couple times, this is our first annual Indigenous Land Symposium, so hopefully next year we'll have more tools coming forward from other people that we can share with everybody. So, it is now 3 o'clock. If you're looking at your agenda, again, this is our first symposium. I made a mistake. It says the break is at 3:30. It's at 3. But bear with me for a minute here, because we have a couple housekeeping items before we get there. So, first of all, to the government and industry people in the room, I'd like to say we have some tobacco ties at the back here that you can get on your way out. We were hoping to have the fun hide lanyards for everybody, but we actually ended up way surpassing the amount of people that we expected registering for this event, so don't take it personally. This wasn't like an assault on you or anything. So we have a couple of events going on right now. Number 1 is a tour of our Innovation Center, which David mentioned. So big shout out to the weather today for being beautiful. I'm going to kick everybody outside. So we're going to be doing tours of the Innovation Center. Follow David Flood. He's going to wait around the entrance, lead a tour down the block. You can see it from outside. If you want to see what's going on inside our Innovation Center, David will take you. I think Shaw's going to help him out. There's also going to be a drum circle outside. So Christina and Adrian will be out there with their drum group. If you go out the doors to the left, there's a little shoveled pathway to a fire pit. If you want to take your tobacco tie and put it in that fire pit as well, that's something that we can do. There'll be coffee and snacks served at the back here, but we do need to kind of reset the dinner area. So that's why I'm kicking you all outside and really glad that it's not snowing. And so we'll be back here at 3:45. If that sounds good to everybody, I'll let you go work off your moose stew.